It's Cover to Cover. I'm Beth.
I'm Naomi,
We're third culture kids in South Korea.
bringing you into the world of Korean books through conversations with authors, translators, and more.
So, the translated Korean book taking bestseller lists by storm this summer is about none other than BTS.
Right, they celebrated their 10-year anniversary this year.
Fun fact, 2013 was also when I first came to Korea.
Happy 10-year anniversary to you as well.
Thank you so much. I can't believe it's already been a decade. The book that we're talking about today, Beyond the Story, 10-Year Record of BTS, was released in July everywhere to commemorate the anniversary of BTS's fandom, ARMY.
It was written by journalist Kang Myung-suk, who is the editor of Weverse magazine, which is run by BTS's agency. He compiled 3 years' worth of interviews with the 7 members, reflecting on the highs and lows of the past 10 years since their debut.
We got to sit down with Arum Jung, an assistant professor in Korean studies at Arizona State University, who is writing a book about K-pop fandom.
We had a wide-ranging conversation with Adam, who talked about how BTS shaped the K-pop industry, how they helped open up the conversation about mental health, ARMY's role in the band's success, and more.
Let's dive in. Hi, Adam. Welcome to the Cover to Cover podcast. How are you?
Hi, Beth. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm fine, thank you.
And before we dive in, can you tell us a little bit about your background, your personal background, like your roots and your relation to Korea and the U.S.?
Sure. I was born in Korea, and then my family and I moved to the U.S. when I was 2 years old, and we came back when I was 7 years old. So I grew up in the U.S. a little bit when I was very young. I can't remember any of it anyway. And then I went to elementary school, middle school, high school, and also university in Korea. That's where I guess that's my foundational years, and that's also when I found K-pop. And then I went back to the States for my master's and PhD program. I also taught there a bit. And then I worked in China for 3 years as a professor of Korean culture and also K-pop. And now I'm moving back to the U.S. So I tend to move around a lot, and I'm very excited where this next journey will lead me.
We've invited you here today because we wanted to get your take on the BTS book that was released recently. What did you think of the book?
So first of all, after I read the book, I also asked my friends what they thought of the book. And, you know, they're very enthusiastic followers of BTS. And of course, as I expected, they already knew like 80%, 90% of, you know, what BTS had went through, the details. But still, I thought this was a really remarkable book for those who kind of knew BTS. Like, of course, you see them on the news everywhere, but if they didn't really know BTS's humble background, like how they became BTS, what we see today, it would be a great introduction, not just to BTS, but also to just general Korean society and also the idol system.
And did you read the book in English or Korean?
Normally when there's like a, original version in Korean and when it's translated into English, I would go for the Korean version just because I'm scared that something got lost in translation. But I really trusted the translators that they will do a superb job. And they really did. They really brought BTS's words into life on the pages. And I'm pretty sure, there's nothing left, in translation. And I really love the translation, so I really also want to say thank you to the team who worked so hard. I watched this interview with one of the translators and the press, and he talked about how they were really pressed for time and they were really rushed, but they did a wonderful job. And so I also want to thank the translators for all their hard work.
Yeah, shout out to Anton Her, Claire Richards, and Celine Jung for translating the book and doing a great job.
Yeah, I really learned a lot reading about their success story. And speaking of their success, BTS has probably broken every K-pop record there is. What do you think is the biggest change that the band has brought about to the industry?
And so, like I said, I was a K-pop fan since I was very little, since what you could call like first generation idols. Back then in the 90s, idols were supposed to be very, mysterious, kind of aloof. You weren't supposed to have like close access to them. You weren't supposed to feel really intimate with them because, they were up there and fans were down here. But I think that's really changed because of BTS. the book also shows how the members had these, unpolished, unscripted content on the blogs, and how, the company trusted them in creating those kind of content. And I think that eventually helped them move to other media platforms like VLive or, YouTube. And because BTS from the very, very early days had constant, daily, frequent communication with their fans were able to, feel close to BTS, have this kind of attachment, have this kind of, an intimacy with them. And they could also witness BTS's growth, daily, annually as they, keep moving, topping the charts. And I think that's really one of the things that BTS has changed. And after witnessing BTS communicating with fans on a quotidian basis and how that affects fans' psychology and their attachment, I do believe that other K-pop companies kind of try to follow those media strategies. And so, of course, BTS has changed many things, but I would say that's one of the things that I find really remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see that they were one of the pioneers of this strategy. Well, we're not sure whether it was intentional or whether it was due to lack of resources, right? Because Big Hit at the time was quite a small company. In the book, there's also a lot of discussion about how much creative control the members, especially RM, J-Hope, and Suga, had in the production process, in the writing of the lyrics and formulation of the songs. So in your view, was this part of what contributed to their global appeal?
Yes, I agree, Beth. I really do think the intense collaboration between the members and also between the members and Bang PD really helped build a team, really helped solidify the team into a very strong one. And, fans can really see that when you're watching live streamings, when you're listening to, their VLives, when you're watching what they're posting on social media. Some people say, well, maybe they're just, acting. Maybe it's all a polished act. But, you can only act for so long, right? And when it becomes a daily quotidian communication, fans know that, if it's something real, if the collaboration is really real, if they're really working hard, if they really mean, if there's really something real, fans know that.
Adam, you mentioned this earlier about how BTS really built up a more intimate relationship with their fans, and we get that in the book throughout as well. What do you think sets ARMY apart from other K-pop fandoms?
One of the things that ARMY has started really early on, before any other fandom did, was supporting BTS in the US by calling radio stations and requesting songs to be played on the radio. And like I said, I went back to the U.S. when for grad school in 2010, and that was even before Psy's Gangnam Style craze. And so I do not remember ever hearing any K-pop song on, for example, on Kiss FM or when I was shopping in Trader Joe's. But then, after Psy's Gangnam Style craze, maybe I would hear Gangnam Style in Trader Joe's maybe once in a while, and but still I wouldn't really hear any other K-pop songs on the radio. And ARMY has really changed that because they dedicated so much time and effort in getting BTS being played on the radio in the U.S. And nowadays, it's not a unusual thing. I read in the articles that Korean language songs are the third most played songs in U.S. radios, and that's a huge achievement. That's something really big. I mean, maybe it's just one song in every 5 hours, but hey, it's still one song in every 5 hours. So I think calling in requests in U.S. radio stations to help support BTS become more mainstream is one of the things that ARMY has done really early than any other fandom.
How big of a role do you think Korean diaspora has in the success of BTS in the U.S. especially?
Now, because I mostly grew up in Korea, I don't think I can really answer that question accurately. But still, I do think that Koreans living in the diaspora feel very proud about BTS and K-pop success, and also, of course, K-drama and everything related to Hallyu. And that has really created a huge impact, not just for Korea itself, but also Koreans living in the diaspora, because people will tend to treat you differently after the Korean wave. They, when I first went to the U.S. and somebody asked me, "Oh, where are you from?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm from Korea." And they would ask me, automatically north or south. And sometimes I would say like middle just to poke fun at them. And sometimes they're like, oh, Middle Korea, is that a thing? But now nobody asks me that question. Nobody asks, oh, is it North or South Korea? They're like immediately, oh, I love BTS, or I love this other K-pop thing, or I've seen Squid Games. It just really struck me how people view you differently because of all these cultural stuff that's happening.
Yeah, an anecdote I wanted to share related to this was, growing up in Vancouver as a millennial, I also had the same experience where most people didn't really know anything about Korea. I mean, the Korean kids hung out to themselves. But I was back in Vancouver last November, and I remember riding the SkyTrain, and I saw a group of young teenage Korean girls come in, and they were speaking in Korean very loudly. And so I just assumed that they were exchange students or, visiting. And then they easily switched back into English. And then I realized, oh, these girls want to show off that they can speak Korean and that they're Korean, maybe in the same way that, like, let's say if you were like a bunch of cool French teenagers, you would like speak really loudly in French or something. I don't know if that's a weird analogy, but yeah, so I think that it really then dawned on me that Korean culture and the Korean language has somehow now gained some kind of new stature that is completely different from what I was used to growing up as a teenager and even in university. So yeah, just wanted to ask you about your experience and your observation about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm really feeling that because according to Modern Language Association, student enrollment in Korean language classes have increased more than 80% since like 2009 to 2016. And that's, as you know, that's really when, K-pop started to pick up. And that's also when, BTS became really big in the US. And I think if it wasn't for K-pop, we wouldn't have a huge increase in student enrollment. Not this many students would be in like Korean culture and history. So I really do think, the Korean wave is benefiting not just, hard industry, but also like soft power in many, many ways.
We know that ARMY has been mobilized for other initiatives or causes outside of K-pop, for example, in the political or economic arena. Could you give us some examples, and do you see that happening in other fandoms?
Yes, BTS and also other K-pop fans of BTS and also other K-pop acts have been very, very active and vocal in expressing their opinions on environmental issues. For example, there is a group called K-pop for Planet, and they're very, very active about, making sure that K-pop is also environmentally sustainable, because right now it's so not. There's a lot of work to be done. And one of the ARMY that I really, really loved reading about was this Italian ARMY who learned about the Seoul ferry disaster because of BTS's Spring Day music video.
As a side note, Autumn is talking about the 2014 sinking of a ferry that killed more than 300 people, 250 among whom were high school students on a field trip.
And she studied about the Seoul ferry disaster, and she made a YouTube clip with her own, interpretations about this is probably what, this is referring to in the music video and so on. And then she even made a trip to Korea to visit the sites of the disaster and also meet with the parents of the Seoul victims. And to me, that was really touching and also surprising because for Koreans, the Seoul ferry disaster is a traumatizing incident, yes, but maybe for people who live in other places, it's kind of very far from them. They might not really relate to why it's such a traumatizing disaster. And to see someone really put in a lot of effort into understanding and sympathizing with the parents and all the nation's trauma, that was really incredible to watch. And also that kind of, I'm also just really personally interested in that because actually, my first book is about how performances represent and commemorate the Seoul ferry disaster. And there's a chapter about Spring Day and also other K-pop songs that directly or indirectly commemorate the Seoul ferry disaster. And so to see that Italian ARMY study about the Seoul and travel all the way to Korea to pay her respects, that was also very, very moving to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always interesting to see the interaction between K-pop and social issues and, especially when it comes to national tragedies or polarizing topics. One thing, just as a side note that I thought was very interesting is how Girls' Generation song has become a gay anthem, the Towards a New World, right? And I thought that, yeah, it's a really interesting example of how there is this inevitable permeability between K-pop and almost solidarity amongst youth especially, but also sometimes even marginalized groups who use K-pop as a vehicle for empowerment. That being said, one thing that surprised me while reading the book was the mention of cyberbullying. We learned that actually netizens do this extreme background checking of celebrities to dig up dirt on them. It's called checks, which is something I learned through this book. And so there was this kind of guerrilla-style rooting for the underdog spirit that animated the ARMY, especially in these early days. So how big of a role do you think ARMY played in BTS's success, especially with this sort of protective attitude that they had?
I mean, fans are everything. Without fans, there is no K-pop. I know people talk a lot about the changes in the industry, like government discourse and technology and everything. But really, to me, K-pop equals fans. And I still remember in the very early days when BTS debuted, and when I read in like internet news, like there's going to be a new group called 방탄소년단. I remember scrolling down, looking at the comment section, and I remember reading things like, well, that's a really weird name, and kind of like mocking the name and also the members, and also because they were back then, they started as a hip hop group. Kind of people also kind of made comparisons to Big Bang, and they were mocking BTS. And I remember very clearly there was a lot of cyberbullying, and that is a huge problem even up to today, because we often see stars who get depressed or anxious because of those kind of comments that they see online, even to the point where they might do something drastic and take their own lives. And so I think there needs to be stricter regulations and also penalties or punishment about cyberbullying even today. And fans really do everything to make sure that their artists, that their favorite idols are happy and they're healthy, and they don't even expect anything in return, but they really perform. I would say it's effective labor. It's a labor of love. It's really a performance of care to protect and make sure that their artists are happy. And so, for example, they will maybe they will fight online with those cyberbullies, or what they also do is they stream music, they download music, they also vote for annual awards, also music TV programs. They also create a lot of events that are not just aligned to these kind of neoliberal capitalist industry norms, but they also do a lot of events that kind of actually go against those industry norms to make meaning for themselves, to create a community. And of course, ARMY has been, the way I see it, the number one factor, the main instrumental factor for BTS's success. I mean, but that also applies to all other K-pop acts as well. I mean, even if you're gorgeous, you're really talented in singing and dancing, even if you have a great producer and songwriter, if you don't have a strong fan base, you can't make it. Fans are everything in K-pop.
I think what was really impressive was just the sheer power and influence fan culture or fandom has, especially in Korea. But what also was surprising to me is I went back home to Hong Kong recently in March, and I thought that, what Korean fans did for their idols, for example, organizing cafe birthday events, printing coffee cup sleeves and merchandise, and all of these things, I thought it was only very specific to Korea. But when I went back to Hong Kong, I realized that fans were doing the same thing. So Korea basically exported their fandom culture to support Hong Kong's own pop stars. So Hong Kong has this really popular band called Mirror at the moment. And I've read in some reports that some of them used to be K-pop fans or are still K-pop fans, but they also became Mirror fans. And they just used almost identical ways in how they supported Korean idols in supporting Hong Kong idols. And I thought that was, it's not just exporting the K-pop model elsewhere, it's exporting other stuff.
Oh, yes, definitely. It's really amazing to see how K-pop fan practices, like you said, travel in other parts of the world. For example, things like transportation advertisements, like the things you see on subways and buses, advertisements for your favorite idols, for example, for a particular like anniversary, like the day of their debut or their birthday, or just to cheer them on. So the very first bus and subway advertisements for idols started around like 2010 and 11. It's actually one of the organizers is a very close friend of mine, and some other fan club members started posting photos of the posters that they saw in Seoul. And so I think I forgot the exact amount, but they raised a huge amount of money in just 12 days, which was more than enough to advertise for buses and subways all over Korea. And since then, we see these kind of advertisements everywhere today. And so my friend said like, oh yeah, I never knew this would like blow up into something so big and universal. And so, yeah, it's also interesting to see how these kind of fan practices travel to other places and how fans adapt them for their local stars as well.
Yeah, in Hong Kong, I think for one of the stars' singer's birthday, they bought a wraparound ad for the tram, and then on his birthday, taking the tram was free for the whole of Hong Kong, and that was their birthday present, I guess, to him.
They paid for the entire day of transportation?
They crowdfunded ads. Yeah, they crowdfunded this whole thing, and it was insane. So his name is Gang To, so they called it Gang To Day.
Yeah, I mean, in Seoul, you'll see posters on the subway saying Happy RM Day or whatever to, commemorate K-pop stars' birthdays.
And turning to another topic, BTS is also known for speaking up about youth empowerment and has contributed to the growing conversation about mental health.
Suga has openly discussed his depression, anxiety, and OCD. And also, RM is a big reader, and the book I Want to Die But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki was one of his picks, which directly addresses mental health in South Korean society.
We reviewed the book, actually, and it's been a bestseller in Korea and abroad, thanks to the RM bump.
And in June of last year, BTS announced a temporary hiatus for members to pursue individual projects, as well as to serve the mandatory military service. And I remember being surprised at how candid they were in disclosing the reasons. RM said, "The problem with K-pop and the whole idol system is that it doesn't give you time to mature." He and the other members also went on to disclose in that video announcing their temporary hiatus that they had been questioning their identity as a group and as artists. For listeners who are not familiar with K-pop, this kind of candid disclosing of your, emotional state and questioning the system of K-pop idols is quite unprecedented.
Yeah, as copy editors, we see stories about K-pop artists taking a break from group activities for unspecified health reasons. The most we get is anxiety or poor physical condition. By contrast, in the US, we are seeing more headlines about celebrities coming forward about mental health struggles through tell-all documentaries or interviews. For example, Taylor Swift, Demi Lovato, Naomi Osaka, etc.
So given all of this, what's your take on BTS's role in raising the topic of mental health in the K-pop industry?
Yeah, first of all, I want to address two things. One is that we've seen many idols talk very frankly about how even when they're unhappy or depressed, they're pressured to act happy and bubbly because their role, their job as idols is to make sure that the people who are watching them also feel happy and energized. And so I think many idols face this kind of huge pressure about always having this facade of happiness, and it becomes very difficult for them to openly reveal what they're really feeling or being honest about some kind of issues that they will be having. And second is that even up to today, even when we talk about mental issues more frequently than we did like 5, 6, 7 years ago, there still is a certain kind of stigma about having mental issues. Like, for example, I have some friends who will talk openly about that they're seeing a counselor or they're, the kind of meds that they're taking or the issues that they're having, and, we'll discuss it and, consult each other. But I also know that some people will maybe frown upon talking about these issues or will just kind of like hide these issues even if they're struggling with it. So I do think even up to today, there's a lot of work to be done about discussing and revealing mental issues in Korea. And in that way, BTS has been a huge game changer in just openly talking about, your depressions or anxieties, or even just, saying that, oh, we're actually just going to take a break for like a month, or we're just going to stop touring for now because of these conditions. And some of you may know that Korea's, I would say, work environment, work conditions are very stressful at times. People expect you to just keep working. And when you're resting, when you're just taking a break, people tend to feel guilty that they're not doing more. Oh, like maybe I should, study some kind of foreign language when I'm taking a break. Maybe I should take up another hobby. It's like you can't just really just space out and do nothing when you're taking a break. It's like you have to be productive even when you're just, spending some free time on your own. So having BTS talk about those kind of issues that they were facing, also just being more open about, oh, we're just going to take a break about something, and also about accepting yourself the way you are and also loving yourself, I think has been very instrumental in changing how we regard mental issues and how we so far has been like just hiding these kind of things when we should actually be very open about them.
Yeah, and I think one thing for people who have never lived in Korea or who don't know much about Korean culture, one thing that's really important to point out is that, at the end of the day, BTS is a South Korean band, and that means that all of the members were socialized in South Korean society, which quite normalizes, first of all, overwork and really prioritizes results over process sometimes. And there's a lot of discussion going on right now in contemporary society, especially between Gen Z, millennials, and the older generation about the value of work and life and balance and mental health, among a slew of other things. And so I think that this is a conversation that goes beyond just the K-pop industry and into South Korean society as a whole.
Autumn, you're working on a book about K-pop fandoms. Can you tell us about it and any other upcoming projects?
Yeah, so my second book is about K-pop fandom. Right now it's called K-pop fandom, ... performing Tteokguk from the 1990s to today. In case you didn't know, Tteokguk is a Korean slang for like stan or very avid, enthusiastic fan. And so I draw from, of course, like theories from cultural studies and media studies, but also there is a lot of my own experiences from the very early 90s up to today. And I look at how fans perform labor to support their favorite idols. And so I look at fans not just as consumers of K-pop, but also as these, incredible people who affect both the industry and also just Korean culture and society. And I look at how sometimes these fan activities, they go in line with the neoliberal capitalist industry, but also sometimes they move away from the industry to create meanings for themselves. And so I look at a variety of fan practices from the early 90s up to today. So there's also a little bit of like history about like how fans operated, how they did things back in the day when we didn't have social media or smartphones or anything. It was all very analog and seems very, prehistoric. And then I also kind of compare them to how today everything is all digital and everything happens, at the snap of your fingers. Everything's just a click away. And I also talk about the media transformations and how technology enabled all of that. And so, yes, I'm still finishing up the last chapter. And university presses take a bit of time than trade presses, so I'm expecting it to be published in early 2025. And also it will be open access, meaning you could buy a book, like a literal copy for like a paper book, but you could also just go online and read it for free, because I really want a lot of people to just read it and enjoy it. And to me, if a lot of people who are interested in learning more about K-pop and the origins of K-pop fan practices, I think that would make me very, very happy.
That sounds super exciting, and we really look forward to your upcoming work.
We know you're an ARMY, but we didn't get a chance to ask you, who do you stan other than BTS?
I would say, I kind of want to see myself as the Mother Teresa of K-pop because even before there was a term K-pop, like in the early 90s, there wasn't the term K-pop. We just said like 가요 or 대중가요, meaning Korean popular music. And idols came onto the scene in like 96. Actually, I would say 95. I was a big fan of 015, Deuce, Seo and Boys, Shin Seung-un. And then, when H.O.T. and Idol and all the other teenage groups came to the scene, I was also a big fan of all of them. You were only supposed to stan one group at a time, and multis were not allowed. And that made me very sad because I was a multi fan even back then. And so, for example, like my friends really loved Checky, who was kind of like a rival to H.O.T. And so I would buy H.O.T. cassette tapes secretly, but I wouldn't take them to school because I knew that my friends would be mad at me. And so, like on the surface, I would tell my friends, "Oh yes, I'm a Checky stan, I'm a Checky fan." But like at home, I would listen to H.O.T. cassette tapes and different kind of groups. And so, I kind of like to dabble in all kinds of groups, and I'm always interested in keeping up with, what's the newest album this week? Like who came out with a new single? And it's not just. Sometimes it might feel like a job because I do research and I teach K-pop, but also most of the time it's more of a lifestyle. I just like it because it's fun, and it's also really interesting to see the changes how K-pop keeps transforming the sound and the style. Nowadays, I'm really immersed with new jeans, new sound, and how they're kind of also changing the way that K-pop looks and sounds. And so, yeah.
Before you go, we're trying out a new segment at the end of each episode where we ask guests the question, what's an interesting Korean word or phrase that you'd like to share? And for me, I'm going to just start first. I recently learned the term 소확행, which is a shortened form of 소소하지만 확실한 행복, small but guaranteed happiness. It's actually a little late to the game. I realized that this was the #1 term in 2018, so dating myself a bit here. But yeah, so I'm going to turn the question to you. What is a term that you'd like to share?
Well, when I told you about my book title, I already kind of explained what 덕후 means, avid, enthusiastic fan. But to kind of go beyond that term, 덕질 means, fanning or stanning, doing fan practices. And among fans in like social media, there's this, term called 어덕 행덕, which is short for 어차피 덕질할 거 행복하게 덕질하자, meaning, well, if we're going to be, stans anyway, if we're going to be standing anyway, let's do it happily, Because we all know standing is not just, flowers and happiness all the time. Sometimes there are complications. Sometimes there are fights that you have to intervene with. And so I think a lot of fans kind of face those kind of struggles. But in the end of the day, we're fanning because we want to be happy. And because it also gives us a source of happiness. And so I would say to everyone who's a fan of, whether it's BTS or other K-pop acts, 어덕 행덕.
Mm-hmm. And we hope that fans of Korean literature will 어덕 행덕 for this podcast or their favorite Korean author.
Thanks so much, Adam, for speaking to us today. We really enjoyed this conversation. And thank you, everybody else, for tuning in. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much for having me.
Before we sign off, we have a K-book recommendation from one of our listeners, Faye from the UK. Here's Faye.
Hi, my name's Faye and I'm from London. I would like to recommend the book Kim Ji-young, born 1982, by Cho Nam-ju. This moving, witty and powerful book stood out for me as I felt the main character could be any woman, but the book was also an eye-opening insight into the harsh reality women face in Korean society.
Thanks, Faye, for listening and supporting Cover to Cover. Please tweet us or leave a comment if you have any Korean book recommendations, and we'll share it in our next episode.